From an autosomal DNA perspective, the Anglo-Saxons that entered England during the early Middle Ages are indistinguishable from the Danish Vikings who arrived a few centuries later. That being said, though, the Danish Vikings would have brought certain haplogroup I1 paternal lines into England that were missing from the earlier Anglo-Saxons. And in this video, I'm going to explain to you how and why I think that occurred.
It's a fascinating story, a journey of survival. Thousands of miles over thousands of years led to this amazing man. From a hunter to a king, let me tell you how it all began. We are his sons. We are I1. We are his sons. We are I1. From the dawn of history to the Viking age, his sons sail the seas to lands unknown. Fierce warriors in battle as the legends go. From a hunter to a king, let me tell you how it all began. We are his sons.
Recently, a new preprint was released titled Steppe Ancestry in Western Eurasia and the Spread of the Germanic Languages. To quote the preprint, quote, during the migration period 1575 to 1200 before present, we find evidence of the structured, admixed southern Scandinavian population representing the Western Germanic Anglo-Saxon migrations into Britain and Longobards into southern Europe. During the migration period, we detect a previously unknown northward migration back into southern Scandinavia, partly replacing earlier inhabitants and forming the North Germanic-speaking Viking Age populations of Denmark and southern Sweden, corresponding with historically attested Danes." End quote. This South Scandinavian connection between the Anglo-Saxons and the Danes is evident in the ancient DNA evidence. This dark green South Scandinavian cluster would spread westward to England during the migration period and northeastward to the Danish islands and Sweden by the Viking Age. They are indistinguishable from each other from an autosomal DNA perspective because they share the same Iron Age source in northern Germany. The Danes would not enter the historic record until the 6th century. There is no mention of them by the Romans. Their power base was situated at Liège on the island of Zealand, ruled by a legendary family of kings known as the Scyldings, as mentioned in the famous poem Beowulf. It is also around this time, during the 6th century, that grand mead halls are starting to be built in Liège. So which haplogroup I1 subclades can be found on the island of Zealand prior to the arrival of the Danes? In the recently released preprint, I counted 24 ancient DNA samples that were discovered on the island of Zealand that archaeologically predate the arrival of the Danes and simultaneously tested positive for a subclade downstream of IDF29. All 24 samples, 100% of them, tested positive for major subclade IZ58, which is also known as I1A2. There was zero evidence for subclade IP109 on Zealand prior to the arrival of the Danes. However, in the 2020 study, Population Genomics of the Viking World, there were 5 IP109 ancient DNA samples discovered on the island of Zealand and Denmark during the Viking Age, and 2 IP109 samples that can be associated with Danish Viking movements to Oxford, England. Based on this evidence, one might automatically assume, and in my opinion incorrectly assume, that the Danes brought major subclade IP109 from northern Germany into Zealand. But if that were the case, then why in the 2022 study, the Anglo-Saxon migration and the formation of the early English gene pool, there were 0 IP109 ancient DNA samples discovered in England during the early Middle Ages, out of 40 haplogroup I1 samples in total? If the Danes are, from an autosomal perspective, indistinguishable from the Anglo-Saxons because they share the same Iron Age source population in northern Germany, and the Danes brought subclade IP109 to Zealand, Denmark, then I would expect to find IP109 in England during the early Middle Ages as well with the Anglo-Saxons, but we don't. What I can infer from all of this data is that there were two migrations into Zealand during this time frame. One large one coming from northern Germany, which explains the autosomal DNA, and a smaller one from Sweden, which explains these haplogroup I1 patronyl lines such as IP109 only being found during the Viking Age. Now, I'm not sure what caused these patronyl lines to enter Denmark from Sweden during the Viking Age. Perhaps it had something to do with trade. Perhaps it had something to do with just the general dynamics of mobility during the Viking Age. Regardless, there are certain patronyl lines, certain subclades such as IP109 that can be associated with Viking Age Denmark and Danish Vikings in England and not the Anglo-Saxons earlier, despite this shared autosomal heritage. Thanks for watching.